Peace, peace, peace. This is Brother Eric. I am sharing with you all today about Maroons. We're going to do an analysis and juxtaposition of the celebration of Juneteenth and the trajectory of liberation that is celebrated in the Juneteenth celebration. And then we're also going to lift up and for some people introduce you to Maroon communities and a celebration that we are starting to call and cultivate in this moment as Maroonteenth, a lifting up and celebrating or celebration of both narratives and both pathways to freedom. We believe that Maroonteenth for us is a celebration or a radical celebration of liberation, not just looking at the ways in which we have been given as acceptable ways or responsible ways to lift up the liberation of Black African American people in this context in the United States of America. But we want to lift up also the ways in which African peoples, African Americans, along with others, have went on a path of liberation. So I won't be before you long. Depending on how you see as long, I could do this for hours. So long meaning like less than a half hour. But I want to thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for the privilege of being able to share insights, to incite discussion, and to instigate investigation further into the works and the examples of our ancestors, and for those elders and those that we come through. So thank you so much and welcome to the first annual Maroonteenth celebration. As you will see, in addition to this lecture, we will also have several digital content and as well as a watch party during this 2020 celebration of Maroonteenth. So please be sure to check out over the next few days what's going on here. And of course, this is always a part of our work and an extension of our political education work. So I'm here to share, and I talked about the themes, or I talked about the topic, and I talked about Maroonteenth. I just want to quickly say for those who may be just tuning in and not very familiar with Black Youth Institute, you should know that Black Youth Institute is a power institution in Baltimore, Maryland. And our work is about a Pan-African power institution, I should be clear. And our work is about, our mission is twofold. It is to combat the conditions of food apartheid while we also build movement toward Black land and food sovereignty. And I mentioned it being a Pan-African one, and not just in our intellectual work, but also in the works that we're doing. We're looking forward to building relationships throughout the African diaspora that's led by us, but also, in collaboration, contribution, and in liberation with other people. So Black Youth Institute has been around since November 2015, and we do that work that I just spoke about, combating and building, in 5 ways currently. So we do that first through our stewardship of an 1.25 acre farm, Cherry Hill Urban Community Garden. And through that, we are growing food and growing people. Really exciting stuff. You should learn more about CHUG, or Cherry Hill Urban Community Garden. That is a part of our People's Urban Agriculture Initiative. Secondly, our food SUSU organizing, which currently looks like the organizing of what we're calling Cherry Hill Food Co-op, a cooperatively owned grocery store in South Baltimore. And then we are excitingly working on what we consider Black food research and knowledge creation. This is a pathway for us to tell our own stories, to contribute to thought and be thought leaders, and contribute to aspects of research or studying to share our own narratives. So that's number 3. Number 4, we operate out of a pathway or initiative area that we call St. Cara Hamer Academy. That is our political education work. In fact, this is one piece of that. political education work. And then also, as well as it's woven through, weaved, if you will, through other areas as well. And then lastly, we operate an action network that we're calling Baltimore Black Land and Food Sovereignty Action Network, a very long name. We'll figure out another name for it. But the goal is for us to specifically to organize Black people to figure out what our goals are around organizing ourselves collectively to move toward Black land and food sovereignty. So I'm hoping that this Maroonteenth celebration not only lifts up what we've been doing, but it raises some questions for us. It raises some considerations for us, and that not just the Action Network, but folks across race lines and socioeconomic lines and other lines are able to engage in dialogue that helps us think about what is liberation, what did it look like in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and what does it look like now in the 21st century, and what trajectories are out there. And before I get going with the pieces or the themes, I want to be clear that this is my analysis, and I'm hoping that folks will add to the analysis, will push back on this analysis, and will spend some time thinking about the questions that are posed and the analyses that are lifted up during this time. So with that being said, again, we're going to talk about two historic trajectories of African peoples toward liberation. And I want to bring up about 5 points for us to think about, and then bring up some questions and possible next steps. And I'm hoping that this is not a stagnant or static conversation that folks are just listening to me, but that you will engage in the comments, that you will spend some time figuring out, your thoughts and reactions, and more importantly, pose more questions, because I believe that liberation only comes by posing questions. It's not about me asserting my thoughts. These thoughts that you're hearing now come from the questions that are in my head often. Particularly in the area of liberation. So we're going to deal with liberation, and we're going to deal with how what these different pathways mean to us, and what it means to me, and what I think it could mean to us collectively, and then what that looks like for us. And so, however, before I do that, I want to make sure that folks have an understanding of what I mean by Maroon communities or Maroon societies, and then what I mean by Juneteenth celebration, or and what those trajectories meant. So again, I want to be clear. I'm not an expert. I am a student. I am a student of history. I'm a student of movements, particularly Black movements, and in the ways in which they show up in the grand scheme, in the everyday struggles that I learned from my dear sister, Dr. Monica White, in her book, Freedom Farms. You should check it out. I'm interested in struggle that leads to liberation in all the ways that we have at our disposal, or in other words, the way that Baba Malcolm X talked about it, by any means necessary. So I want to lift up first Juneteenth. Many folks have had Juneteenth celebrations. But everybody doesn't know about Juneteenth, and not just everybody doesn't know, every Black person doesn't know what Juneteenth is, its significance, and why do we celebrate it. So Juneteenth is a celebration of the freedom of Black people, and the reason why it's celebrated every year on June 19th is because of the history. So here's some historical facts. On June 19th, 1865, in Texas, there was a very interesting and surprising news that came from the African community in Texas. And the emancipation of African peoples happened in January of that year. In 1863. That in 1863, let me back up. African peoples, the news of emancipation came through. But these Africans in Texas were illegally still in bondage, in enslavement, up until June 1865. And so it was on June 19th, 1865 that folks learned that, whoa, we're illegally here. We should have been liberated. And here is the celebration of this news. So that thus Juneteenth, June 19th. All right. So this is as I talk about, and I'll talk about more, a celebration of freedom from enslavement, or at least a form of enslavement, because I would argue that there have been further iterations of enslavement of Africans that we're still dealing with today. But that's what this celebration is about. The celebration was central to this celebration is food and jubilation, and gathering, right? So that when people come together, that, and specific things, mark this kind of celebration. It's red, white, and blue, to celebrate, I think, a connection to the colors of the flag of the United States of America, but also these like very central and symbolic things within the celebration. The eating of watermelon and, having these different colors being celebrated or being represented in celebration. It was initially celebrated in the South, across the South, but over time, Juneteenth eventually made a migration. I'm going to assume that this was based on the Great Migration of Black people and across the United States of America and outside of the United States of America. Folks are celebrating Juneteenth to this day. So you're talking about a couple hundred years of, or close to, so about like 100, over 150 years of this celebration. And if my math is not correct, don't hold me to that. And then there's also been some debate through about like this being a national holiday. And even now, folks will see memes and see posts on Instagram and Facebook where people are continually calling for Juneteenth to be a national holiday. To one, I believe, lift up the history that African peoples not only were enslaved, but celebrating the end of that enslavement. But then also celebrating or lifting it up, making sure that folks know that it should be a national holiday because it is a landmark in this country, and it really lifts up that not only the history of the enslavement of Africans, but also the unfortunate and illegal maintenance of that system of chattel slavery in Texas up until that point. So I want you to consider this. So I gave a bit of a history. Folks can look further, YouTube, find out more about Juneteenth, the celebration. I just wanted to give a general sense. But I want you to consider this. Here's my analysis, that this celebration is a celebration of enslavement and then liberation or re-liberation post-enslavement. That the Juneteenth celebration is a bit limited, and it doesn't point to re-liberation. This is my analysis, specifically pointing to the history that African peoples have before our enslavement in the Western Hemisphere. Liberation was at the hands of the law, and I will talk further about this. Decision makers, and it was determined by policymakers. It was a political act, not a moral act. And so, for example, just like the Civil War, the emancipation of African peoples was about made on economic terms, in the same way that Africans were made to work the fields and houses and industries of colonies, and then the larger United States of America was purely economical. The decision to lift up the physical bondage of African peoples to traverse into Jim Crow laws, another form of slavery, and sharecropping and things of that nature, that was purely about economics, because folks, the tension between the North and the South was causing more of an economic problem and a political problem in this country rather than a moral one. And I believe that if folks could have made the case further, the business case for the enslavement of Africans, past that point, it would have continued. And thus, as you see with the Juneteenth story, that folks were over 18 months still actually over 2 years, still enslaved, shows you that if folks could get away with it, they probably still would. So anyway, that's another conversation for another day. And this particular celebration, unless we do it, I don't know if folks have seen it, but on the surface, historically and contemporarily, the celebration of the emancipation does not lift up other re-liberation narratives that we're going to talk about in a minute, particularly maroonage. Liberalism and white supremacy shows up in standardizing celebration and struggle, particularly, where Juneteenth is lifted up even by white folks, progressive white circles. And I believe that there is a what's the word? A particular pathway that is lifted up, a responsible way to engage in struggle. And this, I believe, by merely celebrating the triumph out of enslavement, ignores other ways that our triumph came through, and specifically under all of it, it gives more homage to the decision makers and policy makers who made the political decision and not the moral one. And the celebration is inextricably tied to white acceptance and Black adherence. Particularly, again, there is this tendency to lift up certain intellectual traditions over others, particularly those that are rooted in European-centered thought. There's in the same vein, there are ways that how to struggle for liberation or what have you is sanctioned, if you will, by the by oppressive systems and by the white institutions that represent the oppressive systems, and other people as well who uplift and perpetuate these systems. There's a kind of a, hey, that's the way you do it, and other ways are demonized. We see that in the debates about Baba Malcolm X and Baba Martin Luther King Jr., Baba Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and other pathways. They are just these internal debates. And in this case, I believe that there are ways that, we're kind of, Juneteenth is acceptable to lift up, but not other, narratives are lifted up as much. And even though Juneteenth isn't always lifted up either, thus many people don't know what Juneteenth is. And then also African and Black peoples, descendants of enslaved Africans in the U.S., have created a celebration from resilience and resistance. Okay, so I want to make sure that we lift that up, and these are my analyses. They're not right. They're not wrong. They're just my analyses. And I think that Juneteenth, while I believe that we should be celebrating the liberation of African peoples from the hands of white institutions and white corporations, that's not the only narrative for how Africans maintain our liberation and re-liberation. So I want to speak really quickly to the act of maroonage and the subject of maroon communities. And there's a bunch of debate about even if we should use the language maroons, but ultimately what you should understand as maroonage is the process of groups of people planning and fighting and resisting enslavement, and then creating maroon societies. These are societies that are, or communities, settlements that were developed outside of the mainstream colonies. And this happened throughout the African world, meaning that it happened across the United States of America, a bunch of examples in Latin America, including Central and South America, in the Caribbean. And there are examples throughout where folks have decided that they didn't want to be enslaved, and developed settlements in many cases in these exclusively communities of diverse African peoples, but in other cases worked with white indentured servants and worked with so-called First Nations peoples around building community. together and maintaining community. So I first learned about Maroons in a very important text in my development called Black Movements in America by Dr. Cedric J. Robinson. And the histories of liberation through Black rebellion, Black uprising, and violent struggle and fugitive or Maroon economies or Maroon societies must be uncovered and amplified at the same level and rate that trajectories of liberation happen through other means, like like the Emancipation Proclamation through policy, and that is codified through Juneteenth celebrations. I articulate that struggle cannot be dictated by the oppressor class or oppressor groups and oppressive structures. And we have to uphold these different narratives. So those Africans and their comrades who liberated themselves must be honored and celebrated as well. And that examples, events, and campaigns like the Haitian Revolution, Nat Turner's Rebellion, Bacon's Rebellion, and massacre led by Demar Vesey or Vesey, and Black Power struggle and its multiple facets are examples of these Black movements of resistance and creating of Maroon communities. I think that Maroonage is one way to lift up again these often violent struggles where people again created communities, diverse African communities, or brought folks together, built community, and the communities themselves were about maintaining their liberation. So that's all I have in terms of the history. I don't have enough time in this segment to go into detail about Maroon communities, but please learn more. That one text is one way that we do that, but there are tons of texts out there that folks can connect with about Maroon communities, and even starting with YouTube. So I want to bring a couple of points around this, right? So I have 5 points. The first point is this. I want to lift up that Juneteenth is a celebration of liberation that happened through the white pen, while Maroonage, or what I'm calling Maroonteenth, is a celebration of liberation in both ways, but particularly Maroonage is about liberation from the black hand. So you got the difference between the black hand and the white pen. And this liberation by the black hand, it disrupted the political process, where the liberation from the white pen through Emancipation Proclamation was deep in the political process. Second point, Maroonage or Maroon communities were steeped in resistance to enslavement, while the Emancipation Proclamation and the freedom from the white pen is submerged in reform of oppressive structures rather than resistance. So again, Maroonage is about being steeped in resistance to enslavement, where the other narrative is about being submerged in reform of oppressive systems. And particularly what I mean by that, or some points to lift that up, is that I can't even read my own writing in this one. So there is a disconnection from imperialism in the case of Maroon activity, or liberatory activity through the black hands, and it allows it follows the it follows the formula of, or disconnects from the formula of imperialism, where liberation from the white pen actually follows the formula of imperialism. And you'll see that through feudalism, you see it through capitalism, where, again, something doesn't necessarily work. And when it doesn't work anymore, folks find ways through policy and other ways to create ways for folks to still maintain oppressive structures, while at the same time determining how to still have a foot on people's necks. The being steeped in resistance to enslavement was also about maintaining freedom, where other was about maintaining status quo, just in a different form. I would say that both, though, are about acts of lifting up or celebrating Maroons and celebrating emancipation through Juneteenth. I think both are about acts of transforming the conditions of institutional slavery. So we should know that when we're lifting up both narratives, that it's clear that for African peoples, it's about changing institutional slavery, and that not one is better than the other. They're just different trajectories. And both of them are in reaction to white supremacy. Both of them about enslavement and colonialism, and which are both central to each narrative. Economics is key to both. One in maintaining economic struggle, the other in maintaining freedom and disrupting the economy. And then lastly, on that point, I think in both cases they're inevitably violent, right? So in some cases there's, with Maroons, there's theft that happens. On the other side, there's theft, but they're very much steeped in violence, and really lifting up that point, because these narratives of Maroons, I feel like, are not necessarily lifted up as a way in which, people see that part of these struggles were physical violence, but but in both cases, to maintain liberation, it has to be violent and disruptive. So point number 4, they both create solid pathways to celebrate and maintain or the maintenance of relative liberation. And I think that in both cases, we have to, lift that up. And then point 5, all right. I believe that we must study and strategize to include or strategize to build power that includes both approaches to liberation. And by both approaches, I mean approaches that change up status quo and build what we can in those moments, but also build the types of freedom pathways that assert our own liberation and assert our own maintenance of liberation and resistance. So I think that we should be studying and checking out the processes, particularly for a liberatory relationship. I think we need to establish and assert liberatory cultural norms, just like in both cases, and build institutions that can create, hold, and perpetuate power needed for liberation across the board. Because I believe that systems change has to come through self-governance. So you got a little bit of both, where self-governance, you see this clearly in maroonage, but where in systems change, you see that very clear in the lifting up and celebrating of our freedom through the white pen. So I contend that we have to do both. And I want to borrow from what Baba Ed Whitfield speaks to. He says we have to create freedom a little bit at a time. He lifts this up in an article that he wrote on liberated zones. Please find out from me on that. I think it's important that we lift up that both of these narratives are ways for us to engage. I think that there are several questions that I have that I would like for folks to think about, and we can share resources and stuff in the comments and all. But I want to lift this up. I think giving some questions and some next steps. So 1, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we lifting up both narratives, and what can we do? 2, what tools and examples exist to support us in doing both resistance work and resilience work? How is this landing for you? That's a question. And then what is the validity of either approach as a deterrent to gentrification and government institutions and other institutions that maintain the status quo? Those are the questions that I have. So if folks can begin to, deal with those questions, I think it would be great. But then also, here's my proposal. My proposal for next steps, that we set up study groups so that we do a deep dive into discussing Maroon communities and determining the utility of these tactics and practices in resistance and the maintenance of power. I think so. One other thing is to explore what this may look like in 2021. I think another next step is to develop a plan of action for Maroon building in Baltimore or elsewhere. I think that we should you could discuss this with your community and organizations that you may represent, your church or any institution that you are connected to. My other one is to very practical, connect with Black Youth Institute with our political education course that will be available for the public in June of 2021. Y'all pray our strength. Also, search. I would say personally, search your soul. Search your soul, and your thoughts about, and gather your thoughts about this idea. What would it look like for us to build our own communities of resistance? And then also, my other, action would be to teach and share and engage in these ideas presented, and your own reflections on them. And then also, lastly, learn more about our organization and other organizations and efforts with radical frameworks, like co-ops, like intentional communities, and other efforts that we can learn more about what maroonage looks like in the 21st century. Because I think there are many examples of marooning that we see, or at least the threads that are here, showing people's ability to rise up and stay risen. So that's one thing that I've been talking about. Uprising, I think, is amazing. I think is important. But I think that what Maroon showed us is that you can uprise and stay risen by creating communities and entities that actually are based on maintaining reliberation and maintaining power. So these are my proposals. These are thoughts that I have. I feel that it's just my opinion that we have to imagine a world that's different. And in doing so, I think it starts with celebrating Juneteenth and celebrating what we're calling Maroonteenth and lifting up both of these narratives of liberation. And can you imagine a world? You imagine a world like Baba Ed Whitfield talked about, creating freedom a little bit of the way, but you have to have a longer vision plus your process. And I believe that in order for us to do that, we have to imagine. We have to use the ability to imagine. I know that that's one way that white supremacy impacts us, and that is on our imagination. And when I say us, I mean the collective us. I mean Black people and other people of color that are part of the BIPOC category, but also white people as well. We're duped to believe that we can only fit into certain social positions. And I think we have to imagine ourselves differently, but also imagine this. Imagine that there was a time where folks didn't see horses as obsolete. And not to disrespect or disregard horses at large, but I'm talking about horses in terms of transportation, as transportation methods. There was a point where if you would have told somebody they're going to be cars and they're going to be on 2 wheels or 4 wheels, or however many wheels they are, and we'll be able to transport our goods and transport ourselves that way, people would have said, that's ridiculous, what are you talking about? So we have to be able to imagine something different than what we see today. And I think that in doing so, our first step would have to be imagining a world where Black people actually have communities, physical communities, and institutions and processes that we owned, that we are a part of, that's central to what we do. And I believe that that's the first step. So I think for me, I want to continue these conversations, continue these questions. I want to share resources. Please use the comments to share resources and all. But I'll say this one last thing. Just imagine, what would it look like for Black folks to control our own food in Baltimore? What would it look like for us to own land? What would it look like for us, people in Cherry Hill, and people who may want to be a part of Cherry Hill to own land that is already federally owned. We just have to imagine. But I don't think that we can do that without celebrating these histories and knowing what we come from and what the possibilities are. So let's practice Sankofa. Let's return to those stories and narratives, and let's bring them to the 21st century so that we are celebrating several trajectories of liberation while we're moving to liberation for ourselves. Peace. I appreciate y'all. And as we do in Black Youth Institute, in addition to learning and studying and talking and imagining, we keep the flame. So thank you so much. Keep the flame. Bless.